So growing up, one of my favorite classes that I ever took in grade school was my junior year of high school, and it was AP Statistics. Not for reasons you might think, not just because I'm some big nerd or something, which I actually am, that'd be a fair description, but not because I love numbers, but because the teacher on the first day of class started this way. She said, "I've never taught this class before, and I'm not sure why it's been assigned to me, but I'm at least going to make it fun." And she did. And by fun, basically that meant that we would just hang out sitting on desks. Most days we would just go in, check in with attendance, and then leave. It became like another off period. It was fantastic. So I loved the class. And the one thing we kind of had to do was there were these book reports that were due because all the other statistics class did them as well. And so she would give us time to just read in class because what kind of high schooler reads outside of class? So we would do that. We would sit there and we would read. And the first book assigned that we had to do a report on was Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. And it was the first time I'd come across any of his work. Obviously, he's a brilliant thinker. The first time I was exposed to some of his ideas about, the time of year that you're born or the year that you are born dictating so much of what you do with life or sport you play or how successful, just all these crazy things he connects. But it was also the first time I had been exposed to the 10,000 hour rule. Most of you are probably familiar with this at this point, but it's the idea that in any given field, craft, talent, profession, it takes about 10,000 hours of intentional experience, practice, and training to ultimately become an expert in or to master that field. It's not specifically 10,000 for all fields, but the idea is it takes way more time than we would initially think to really master any given area. It makes me think about in the book, The Power of Habit, it's a New York Times bestseller, he gives the example of Super Bowl winning coach Tony Dungy with the Indianapolis Colts. And when he first came in, he implemented these very simple, elementary drills that were, you could say, is almost like offensive to complex NFL defenses and so on. And they would run them again and again and again and again. And his reasoning was, when it's actually game time and you're exhausted, I don't want you to have to think about what to do next. I want it to be such a habit that you respond instinctually. But that philosophy or that approach takes a lot of practice. And so today in part 3, I kind of hope that Allen Iverson nor Coach Lasso are in the room because we are indeed going to be talking about practice. It's kind of ironic that he's known for that because he's one of the most skilled players of all time, right? Obviously, he spent thousands and thousands of hours practicing. But I think this is something that we inherently know or understand when we think about the best in any field, the most successful, those that we look up to are the most talented. We understand, there might be some natural inclination or some natural talent there, but to be the best of the best, these people have spent thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of hours cultivating their craft, right? Until we know one day what their name is. That guy, Arch Manning, has practiced his craft, right? We got to see that yesterday. No experience yet and just came around on the scene. But you get this, right? We're understanding there's these hours that people are not watching and seeing. And so my question is, why is it then, when we do this with all the other areas, why do we assume when it comes to faith, why do we assume it's just easier for some people than others? My background is in student ministry, and I would have so many conversations with students. There would be this almost guilt, this conviction. They would just be like, I don't know why I can't just believe like so-and-so. I don't know why I can't just have faith like them. Is there something wrong with me? We would say things, and I think we as adults say this too, things like, I just haven't felt God lately. He doesn't feel very close to me. It's like we break the world into, there's just some religious people and some non-religious people, and I'm just not like those religious people. Like we're missing some kind of gene, faith is something that you just catch like a cold and then you just have it. But we don't approach any other area of life that way. I don't walk around feeling guilty about the fact that I can't shoot the three like Steph Curry when I haven't picked up a basketball since high school. I get the gap, right? I don't feel guilty that I can't perform like Taylor Swift for lots of reasons, or why I can't invest like Warren Buffett, or we just understand that these people are experts in their fields. And so what I would like to suggest is, what if following Jesus is meant to be intentionally practiced over time? It's not something you just have, this great faith. What if it is meant to be trained, coached, You'd have a mentor that you would try and you would fail and you would try again and you would learn and you would grow and you would keep showing up. And over time and over a lifetime, That might cultivate someday that great faith of people that we look up to, these steady people in our lives, great heroes of the faith, maybe somebody's book we read or something. These people that we look up to and admire have probably spent thousands and thousands and thousands of hours cultivating that faith, practicing that faith, doing life with Jesus. The reason that this is the question of part 3 is it's a natural follow-up to the first 2 parts. And so if you haven't been here, or even just to kind of refresh you if you have been, in part 1, we asked the fundamental question of who is Jesus? We can't have a conversation about the way of Jesus or following him unless we know who that is and how we personally would answer that question. So we looked at lots of options, but we landed ultimately on John 14, which is the inspiration of this series, where he gives an I am statement. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And we said the bottom line really of our whole series is that in Jesus, we find the way, discover the truth, and experience the life we were made for. That all of us, whether we've grown up in church or this is our first time here today, we're all searching for that list somewhere. We have somewhere that we find truth, somewhere that we try and find life. What if it's actually found in Jesus? What if that's what we have been designed for? And then in part 2, Buck was up here and he said the natural follow-up to that question of making a decision about who is Jesus is to accept his invitation to very simply come and follow me. He talked about what following looked like in the first century as well as today. He talked about some of the history of that, some of the different phases of following, this discovering and following and ultimately knowing, having this oneness, being with Jesus. He talked about some of the barriers as to why it is that we don't follow in our life. And the first 2 parts were very foundational. They're very kind of conceptual, if you will. Today, I want to try to get very practical, that you would walk away and no matter where you are in your faith journey, you would know what the next step is for you. Like to actually do. I don't just mean like prioritize Jesus. What does that mean? I mean that you would actually know what to go do practically with your time. You would know how to practice faith, if you will. So if we go back to our question that is introducing this third part, what if following Jesus is meant to be intentionally practiced over time? I'd like to suggest, what if we're all in our 10,000 hour journey when it comes to faith? Whether you didn't know yesterday that you would be in church today and you came with a friend or you got an invite to a link online that somebody sent you, or you've grown up in church your whole life. What if we're somewhere in that 10,000 hour journey? What if we are all practicing, learning, trying, failing, but growing? And while it's not a direct upward trajectory, it looks a little bit up and down over time, it's heading in a direction of experience the benefits of what it is that following Jesus has to offer us. Now, when you think about it in that kind of analogy, when you think about 10,000 hours, if you were to think about practicing faith with just probably some of the common practices that would come to your mind, if I was to say, how did you do that? And you'd be like, well, I think you'd go to church, or you'd read your Bible, you would pray. If you look at the average Christian, not the average American, but the average Christian, that would be 23 hours a year that you would spend in church, 30 hours a year reading your Bible, and 18 hours a year praying. Now, to go back to the high school statistics for a second, this is the mean or the average, which means it is actually skewed quite a bit by a very small percentage of Christians that go to church every Sunday and read their Bible and pray every single day. If you look at the median or more the middle of the ground, that's like cut in half. The average is just really going about once a month and a couple hours a year spent reading your Bible and praying. Why does that matter? If we just continue to follow the idea, the illustration, that would mean if those were your 3 and you were average, it would take you 140 years to reach your 10,000 hours. Meaning if you are 70 and you have grown up in church your whole life, you're about halfway there. And none of us are going to make it. The oldest person in the world just actually died 3 weeks ago. They were 117 years old, right? We don't get past 120. Like, none of us are actually going to get there. So either we need to spend way more time doing these 3 things, or there's more than just these three things to practicing, to the way of life that is life with Jesus. And if you were to hone in on just one of them, if you were to pick Bible, for example, it would take 333 years at the pace we read. And so no wonder we find it confusing. No wonder we're like, I don't know where to start or what's in there, all these things. Because, I mean, we spend more intentional time studying for law or to be a doctor or any of these important professions in our life, way more than we do the text of the Bible. Of course it's confusing to so many of us. And I wonder, I really don't mean this in a shaming way. I think this is so important. Like, this is just an open, honest conversation, right? If we want to grow, if we desire something to be different in our story in the future, I mean, we just got to pause and think about where it is that we're at. And I just wonder, if part of the reason that this research study was done by Barna a few years ago isn't because of the fact that Christianity for so many is a hobby, not necessarily a way of life. What the study found is that 84% of Americans know a Christian personally. Like I could name one that's my neighbor, a family member, a friend, or I work with one. But only 15% said they know one whose behavior is different in a positive way. That's a huge gap, and that's so significant to us. Whether you are a follower of Jesus, that should be significant to you because you do give way too much time, especially over a lifetime, for nothing to be different, for your life to just look kind of like it always has, to not experience any of the benefit, the peace, the joy, the freedom, the love, the new identity that's found in a relationship with Jesus. You give way too much time for things to stay the same. And I think it matters if you care about people who are not followers of Jesus, like our vision to make Jesus relevant for everyone in Greater Austin, to see the numbers reversed one day in the city of Austin. If you care about that group of people at all, which is 90% of the people of our city, I think it's significant because if you're being honest, and maybe you're here today, maybe part of the reason that you were skeptical to take an invite or to tune in online is because this is your experience. You're like, yeah, I look around and the people who call themselves Christians in my life, I don't feel like their life is all that much different. Or maybe if you're being honest, it's kind of gone the other way. They got involved in a church and now it's like they're weirder and they're more judgmental and they're like less fun to be around. And it's like, I don't want that, right? Understandably so. So we've got to address this gap that I think largely exists, again, because faith is so often, for so many of us, a 10th priority on our list. And if that is, let's just be honest about it. Not to feel guilty or shameful. Let's just be real about that and understand that, man, we're probably not going to hit that 10,000 in our lifetime if it's that far down on the list. It's G.K. Chesterton who I think says it so beautifully and kind of challenging, in a challenging way as well, when he says the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It's not that it is empty. It might actually be the thing we are all looking for. It has just been found difficult and left untried. And so instead, we just kind of prefer to keep the status quo, to keep things the way that it's always been, that change is scary. And so as a result, we don't see a lot of this transformation in our lives or in our relationships with people around us. Part of the reason I think this conversation is actually so important is because I think there's a very common misconception when it comes to the Christian faith that because we're made right with God based on what Jesus has done for us, that's called grace, because it's based on him alone, his work, his life, death, and resurrection, that we then think we do nothing in response, that our action now doesn't matter in response. I just get to go to heaven someday when I die. In reality, think about it this way. I think it's Dallas Willard that sums this up so well. He says, grace is not opposed to effort. It's opposed to earning. Grace, of course, is not opposed to your life changing, to new behaviors or behavior modification. Of course, it's not opposed to obedience or working hard to be faithful. It is opposed to you thinking that once you've done that, you've somehow earned God's love or earned his forgiveness, or now you're better than the person sitting to your left and right because you've done more of the activity than they have, and it's a competition with them. That's what grace is opposed to. It's not opposed to effort in your life as a response to God's incredible love for you and the love that you have for him as a result. I don't think this concept is really all that complicated to think about. I just don't think we apply it to faith all that often. Like, we get the idea that practice is important. And it doesn't take long as you just go through the scriptures, especially in the New Testament, to realize this isn't just some motivational YouTube speech, right? You see this theme kind of everywhere. In fact, I just want to share a couple of them with you because, again, I think that you get this. What I really want to do is spend the bulk of our time talking about what it might look like to actually practice. What would be the things that you actually do? Give a bunch of options to you because in a room this size and this diverse, it's not going to be the same for everybody. I'm going to ask you to choose just one. But take a look first, before we get to that list, take a look at just some of these verses that are so clear about what we're called to, how it is that we respond to grace. Paul says, train yourself for godliness. For while bodily training is of some value, notice it is of some value. I've had some people ask, does that mean that it's like no value? Like I can cut my gym membership, doesn't matter how I eat? No, there's some value there, but godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. That the training, the intentional training of my soul is of ultimate value. He says in 1 Corinthians, he gives this metaphor. He says, run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly, just wondering. I kind of hope I'll wake up 30 years from now and I'll finally kind of have that peace, that confidence, that faith that I've always hoped for. No, it's intentional. I don't waste my time. I'm intentional with my time. Maybe a summary of all of his kind of teachings on this is in Philippians when he says, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, spending time with me, emulating that you see in me, put it into practice. And then the God of peace will be with you. You'll experience the blessing, the result, the reward of that kind of intentionality and faithfulness. It's, of course, not just Paul. James, the half-brother of Jesus, is famous for his one-line statement when he says, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. It's like Nike, just do it. Sometimes it's simpler than we make it out. Like, just try it, just experience, just take the next step. Where do they all get this from? Of course, their inspiration is the way of life, the person of Jesus, his example and his words. In fact, to the end of the Sermon on the Plain, which is parallel to the Sermon on the Mount, the most famous speech ever recorded in human history, that sermon is the foundation of modern-day ethics, especially in part of the world where we live. The Sermon on the Plain mirrors that. Some people think it's the same speech, just abbreviated. A lot more people think Jesus probably gave the Sermon on the Mount multiple times in multiple locations, that same content. And it ends the same way that the Sermon on the Mount does, the Sermon on the Plain in Luke 6. It says the student is not above the teacher. This is Jesus speaking now. But everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. This really correlates with what Buck talked about last week. He talked about this idea of getting dusty, that you would follow a rabbi in the first century so closely, do so much life with them, that it's like they would kick up the dust onto your robes. That's how connected you are to their rhythms of life. And he's saying, here now, I'm the teacher, that the end goal is to be like him or to be Christ-like. Even more than to say, hey, biblical or follow biblical principles, it's to be like the person of Jesus is the end goal. And after all these teachings, all these kind of ethics and morals and ways to follow, he gives this metaphor, this conclusion that really has inspired names of churches and all kinds of different songs, this idea of building your house on a foundation, on a solid rock. He talks about this in 6:46. He asks a question, and he says, why is it that you call me? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? This is one of the options to the answer of who is Jesus that we gave in part one. We said maybe the simplest and most comprehensive is just the one-word title, Lord. It speaks to his authority in our life like a king. It speaks to his divinity. That's what God was called in the Old Testament. It speaks to how it is that he saves us, because Romans says that if you believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord, you'll be raised from, and that he was raised from the dead, you too will be saved. So it's this comprehensive title. And then he says, if you call me that though, like if you go that far to say you're number one, like our trust is in him, he's our ultimate authority, why then would we not do what he says? Those two things seem incompatible. And he gives us this metaphor in 47. He says, as for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. He's speaking to this, when you build your way of life based on me as the foundation, you're sturdy, you're strong. It's like you can withstand the storms and the hurricanes. You're not just blown away when life gets difficult, when somebody does something to you, somebody hurts you, somebody betrays your trust, when you do something that complicates your own life and story, when something happens bigger in the world around you. It means we're not easily swayed by a TikTok at 2 a.m. that challenges everything we've ever believed. It's not that simple because you have this solid foundation, because you've been practicing over a lifetime, because to a degree you are immovable with Jesus. He says that's one option. That's one way. In fact, he finishes that part when he says, when a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it because it was well built. But there's another option. There's another way available to us, which is, but the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built his house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete. And you surely know somebody who this is their story. Maybe this is in your story, that you were around faith, that you did some of the activities, that it was a little bit in a hobby category, but it wasn't like rooted in. It wasn't something where like, I'm actually following the person of Jesus. I just know some ideas about it. I could put some Bible verses with some political ideas, but it wasn't like I was following the person of Jesus. And you realize, man, when it's in this hobby category, it's a dangerous place to stay. You start there. It's a dangerous place to stay because over time it can't withstand the winds and the experiences of life. See, if you're doing the math, and this is my last stat reference, I promise, but if you're doing the math, those 10,000 hours that we're trying to get to, it just either feels like, again, we've got to do a whole lot more of those three in a way that almost feels unsustainable, or there's more to the way of Jesus. There are more practices, more ways that we invite him in on a daily basis. And I'm convinced that's what it is, that at some point, it's almost like your journey with him becomes this experience of exponential growth. That at the beginning, it was trying a thing, that I showed up to a church and I had a conversation, and it was an hour here and a moment, an experience, and maybe I read a book. But that with time, the longer you practice, the more you experience the benefits of those practices. It's like every day, I participate with him. It's like the people that you most look up to in faith, it's like they're practicing 16 hours a day. Because yes, they go to church. Yes, they read their Bible and pray, but also they're practicing faith in the way they capture their own thoughts and submit them to Christ. They're practicing their faith in the way they battle the daily temptations of life. They're practicing their faith in the way they treat neighbors and coworkers and people you like, and especially people that you do not like. Because that is going to be one of the greatest litmus tests to are these practices actually working. Meaning that the way of Jesus that we're invited into, it's a way of life. It's not an hour a week or a month on our calendar. It's a way of life to be practiced, to have grace for ourselves, to not be comparing ourselves to others, but just where we are at, to know there's a next step in front of us, and that at times we're going to fail, and at times we're going to go the wrong direction, and that's part of practicing and being mentored and coached and supported along the way. So I'll tell you what is the application question up front, and then we'll spend the rest of our time with what I said up front. I want to give some options of what practicing might practically look like for you. But the application before I show you the list is very simply, what is your next step? Not just the person who invited you. We're all somewhere on our own faith journey. So what is your next step? You've all taken one just by being here or tuning in online today. You've all taken a step. So whether that's the first one you've ever taken or you are decades into this whole following Jesus thing, what is it for you? What's the next one in front of you? Because when it comes to Jesus, the best is always yet to come. There's always more to look forward to, always more adventure, always more ways to know him. So what is your next step? I want to suggest that you choose one. As I go through this list. You'll be tempted to choose 10, and that's not my hope for you, because I think what happens is we overestimate what can be done in a day, and then we quit and get burnt out and feel shame and then walk away again. But we underestimate what can be done in a lifetime of obedience, a lifetime of faithfulness, a lifetime of one step at a time, one brick at a time. I think we severely underestimate what God has for us in that. So the first step that would be available to you is actually a callback to Buck's last week, and I just want to make sure I bring it in again before I give this whole graphic. But the first is an invitation to make a decision to follow Jesus. And this is all what Buck talked about last week. He talked about the extraordinary truth that it is available to all people. That what Jesus did through his perfect life, death, and resurrection, paving a way to God, that he is the way to God, that his grace, his freedom, that reconciliation with God is possible for every single one of us, regardless of our story. That's an invitation that is extended to every single person. And I would just say, have you personally made that decision yet? And have you decided that, when I think about it, I do a lot of the activity, but maybe I'm caring about more of my family, more of my spouse, more of my kids, but have you decided for you personally, you just told somebody about it? Like, have you prayed? Have you talk to the person who invited you or family member to just kind of like plant that moment, mark it in the ground and say, I want to turn from my ways and I want to follow his. The next step after that may actually be to get baptized, what we just watched together about 20 minutes ago. The idea of that was the example throughout the New Testament, was this internal decision that was made and then an external celebration of the story of what it is that Jesus has done in my life. If you're in that phase, that's the discover phase that Buck talked about last week, just that beautiful time of curiosity, of pushback, of asking your questions, of meeting with people, of reading books, research, whatever it might be, just continuing to show up. But that's a foundational first step. And then from there, what I'd like to introduce is something that may not really be sequential. There's not necessarily like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as you go through this, but an opportunity to say what on this list might be the one next step for you. And I would say for each of us, there's an element of whatever you would call Bible and prayer, quiet time or time with God, and then community. This is foundational to say some daily habit of reading my Bible is the way in which I understand who God is, who Jesus is, what it is that he desires for my life. It's how I come to know him and his truth. It speaks life into me. It gives me direction. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. We understand his truth by spending time daily in the scriptures. Prayer, obviously, that's that opportunity to communicate with God, to express to him who he is and be reminded of that. Yes, to present our requests to him, to also just sit in his presence, perhaps to sit and listen to what it is that he has for us. And we refer to that as time with God because we think that's what it is. It's that intentional practice, right? Like I think about with my wife, Emily, I spend a lot of hours around her every week. But there's a few specific moments that are most important. There's a daily check-in. How was your day at work? There's a weekly meeting that we do to check in on our important rhythms. There's a date night. And those specific hours are so much more important and life-giving to us than the hundreds of hours we spend around each other and taking care of our kid and sleeping and all of that kind of stuff, right? Is the idea to say, I have an intentional time. Yes, God's always present, but an intentional time to meet with him. Now, as you do that, one of the natural results is going to be a change in how you interact with people and an ability to practice what you're experiencing with people. Christianity is not a private faith. It just isn't. You can't practice Christianity in the desert or in the mountains. You can take a retreat. You can write a book there. But you cannot live out love God and love people in isolation. You cannot live out love your neighbor as I have loved you in isolation. Right? So this is a community-oriented faith in how we practice. And so community is church. It is what you're doing right now by showing up and engaging. Community is even more specifically community groups, smaller group of maybe 12, 15 people that you're doing life with actively on a regular basis. Perhaps even more powerfully, it's a couple, 1, 2, 3 people that really know you like 100%, all guard has been dropped. Community is also the people that you live around. It's your neighbors. It's your coworkers. And it's people that may believe something totally different than you. It's people that may have a totally different political viewpoint. That if you're being honest, you roll your eyes or feel a little bit of disgust when you see their bumper sticker or their yard sign. But one of the greatest litmus tests of are the practices working is how you treat and engage and love those people. So community and time with God, like those are foundational, those are basics. That is like the starting point. That is dribbling. That is keeping your eye on the ball. That is grammar if you're a writer. I mean, that's the starting point. And then from there are so many ways to create space for Jesus. At Northpoint, we'll talk about these big 4 a lot. We've actually already talked about one of them. Community or groups is one of them. But 4 things that you can do in an environment like this that you can't just do in isolation. Bible, prayer, you can do that on your own in isolation. But 4, you would need to be a part of a local church. One of those is service. So that's to say I'm going to use my most valuable resource, my time, to recognize that I'm a part of a story bigger than myself, what God is doing in the world. It aligns your heart with the heart of Jesus because he said, I didn't come as one to be served, but to serve. One of the most spiritual things you can do is remember the 6-year-old's name that's walking into your Upstreet class each week, or learning what is the latest Gen Z slang of this week, and it'll change next week, right? But those are beautiful moments, that investment to say, I am a part of something bigger than me. It keeps our heart, our posture healthy and aligned with Jesus. It puts us outside of our comfort zone and learning for the right reasons, not just to get smarter or more intellectual, but learning for the right reasons to serve and to love people well. We talk about inviting. To say inviting, now we put on a whole new lens when we come in on a Sunday, right? Because over time, the gravitational pull is towards insider. Over time, the gravitational pull is what has my church done for me lately? You know, are the sermons still doing it for me? Is the music still doing it for me? And so I want them to add whatever tree to program or all that might be. But when you're inviting somebody, you have a whole different lens that you evaluate with. And I would say it's a healthier one because it is others focused. And you come in and you just hope that the signs haven't fallen down in the street and your friend can make it here appropriately, right? I mean, you want it to be clean and smell good, things you've never thought about before. You want Wombaland Upstreet Transit Inside Out to be well-staffed and adults that aren't like begrudgingly, they made me come again, but love being there, right? You hope that whoever's on stage doesn't say something just super weird. It's like, please be normal today. Like, you know, you just have a whole different lens because you're thinking through the lens of your family member, your friend, your neighbor that you care about. That's a spiritual practice that aligns your heart with the heart of Jesus, who clearly prioritized the one. And then generosity. This is not something that just pastors have made up for fun, right? This is one that obviously I know there can be some tension to wade into. But the reason that Jesus talked about our stuff, our money, our resources, more than any other practical topic, is simply because he knows that it's the greatest competition for our hearts. And it is, when we're being honest. Like if your deep desire, your thing is security, for example, it is really easy to be tempted to find our safety and security in our 401k or our bank account or our umbrella insurance policy over the person of Jesus. If your thing is affirmation or recognition, if it's an identity thing, it is so easy to find that in our job title or the neighborhood that we live in or the car we drive than in our faith, confidence, and trust in Jesus. And so the invitation to be generous is to just say, I'm not going to let that get my heart. Because Jesus doesn't want your stuff. He wants you. He wants a relationship with you. He wants your heart. And generosity is just an active practice to say, I'm going to pick a percentage. The biblical precedent is 10%. If for you that sounds astronomical and you got all kinds of questions, 1% of your income might be a first step that you try. Some of you have been giving 10% for so long you don't even think about it. It doesn't move anything in your heart. There's maybe an opportunity to be even more generous than that. But the whole point is to create space to be like, this stuff is not going to get me. I'm going to use it to bless. I don't need it. What I need is the person of Jesus. And then from there, after those four, let's say you've been engaged in church for a while. I mean, that's a lot. If this is your first day back in a while, you're already like, well, I need to go, right? I mean, that's a lot. But let's say you're like Bible and prayer, a regular part of your rhythm. Let's say you're in a group. You've been serving, right? You give generously. Let's say you're intentional about your neighbors, your coworkers. You know your faith isn't just about you. And still, you've reached a point where you're like, and is there more? Like still there's this hunger, desire, thirst for more, this connection with the person of Jesus. Yes, there's always more. There's always more to the adventure of a journey of the way of life of Jesus. Dallas Willard famously picked 16 different spiritual practices. John Mark Comer wrote a book this year called Practicing the Way that's inspired a lot of the series. He has 9. I mean, there's always more to explore. I'll throw a couple up here just to maybe demystify some of these that you've probably heard of before and see maybe one of them is a step for you. For example, fasting is probably one of the most misunderstood practices. Maybe you think that's a thing of history or a part of another denomination or something. But fasting is the intentional practice to say, I'm going to abstain from most commonly food. Maybe it's a social media or technology fast or something like that. But it aligns mind, heart, body, and soul. That in the Christian worldview, those are all one anyways. And so it's aligning those things as you physically abstain from something. It's like making your spirit, your soul come alive. And you're realizing, God, I am so dependent on you. I mean, skip a meal and you realize how fragile we are, how much we need him to daily sustain us. And it's practicing saying, God, I want to, even if I don't know I can say you, I desire you more than the cheeseburger right now. Like, I want to desire you more. And I'm practicing that to say you are more important than this temporary thing in my life. That's the practice of fasting. You choose a meal, you choose a day, and just experience, like, what is that like for you? This idea of rest and solitude is say maybe one of the most spiritual things you could do is to take a nap. Rest and solitude is this rebellious countercultural act on your part in the world and the culture that we live in today to say in a culture that values productivity and full schedules and success, I'm going to pause for 24 hours from my huge to-do list and all the things that still need to be done at work, and I'm just going to say, God, I trust you with all that, and I'm going to slow down. I'm going to focus on you. I'm going to breathe deep. I'm going to enjoy my community, my friends, my family. And you're going to experience a restoration of your soul, restoration of your spirit. Maybe you've heard of the word Sabbath before and been confused about what that means. It comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat. It's modeled by God when he rested after the seventh day. He commanded the Israelites to do it. But it is this reminder when you pick a time period to just stop, to recognize the world doesn't revolve around me. It's not on my shoulders. My company doesn't need me in the way that I think they do, or it's not the right company. It's this recognition to say, oh my gosh, God, you've got it, and I can breathe. Or, the last one on here, a daily practice of gratitude. This is a focus on what God has already given us and blessed us with, instead of all the things we think we still need from him to be content and happy. Every season of life has some beautiful things with it and some hard things, and you have the opportunity to focus on what you don't have or what you have actually been blessed with. For me, in my daily time with God, I have 3 questions that I answer. I try to keep them short, and one of those 3 questions I answer every day is, what's one thing from yesterday that I'm grateful for? Sometimes I really have to search. Over time, it's become like a habit. It's easy to find a quick list of all the ways that God shows up on a daily basis. It changes your perspective on the world, on him, and towards other people as well. Are there more than these? Yes. Are there nuances to these? Yes. But this is the graphic completed to say, are one of these your next step? The ancients would take this and they would actually create what they called a rule of life. And it wasn't just for them, it was really for their community, it was for their family, but they would literally chart out on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis. How am I going to engage with these practices? To direct my time, not be aimless with my time, and be formed into the way of Jesus. Because the way of Jesus is a way of life ultimately to be practiced. I want to give one caveat here and one closing question as we walk out. The caveat is this: I understand that the whole direction, momentum, flow of this message could feel legalistic. The outcome could feel like I got a lot of homework, a lot of guilt, I'm not doing enough, comparison to the person sitting next to me. That misses the entire point of this message. The point of the practices are to create space to connect with Jesus. That's the point of every single one of those on the wheel, is to create space in your rhythms to connect with him. This is not to guilt you. This is not to shame you. This is not like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? I came in here. I just making it to church is a big deal, and you gave me 10 more homework assignments. No. This is a lifetime. This is one step at a time, one brick at a time. It gives you something to look forward to, so I'm not going to be bored of faith 6 months from now. But you don't do all of these at once. You pick one and see which one creates space for Jesus, and the end goal is still the same. The end goal is still what Jesus talks about in John 15 when he says, remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. It doesn't mean do nothing and sit on your couch. It means do life with him. Engage with him. So let me ask you this question then that I hope inspires you to keep engaging with the series and perhaps take a step yourself. The question is very simply this for you to think about. What kind of blank am I becoming? You're going to wake up 10, 20, 30 years from now and will be more fossilized into the person you're becoming. More of your story will be written. And you will wake up having been some type of spouse, some type of parent, some type of friend, son or daughter, neighbor, worker, boss, leader. And I would just ask, what kind are you becoming? Because the practices aren't optional in the sense that we all have practices. We all have habits. We all have daily rhythms. You are forming into something. You are becoming something, all of us. I just want you to become something on purpose. So I'd ask you, am I becoming that thing on purpose? And I most specifically want you to become who it is that God has created you to be. Because that's where I think the way, the truth, the life is found. So let me ask again, we've asked it throughout the series, but what is your next step? Not your next 10, not your 5, not even your 2, just of these as you see them on the wheel, what is one for you? And would you have the courage today to tell somebody that leaving here, text somebody, and take that step this afternoon, tomorrow morning perhaps? Would you pray with me? Father, we just acknowledge this is a lot. This is a lot of information, a lot of activity, a lot of steps, and God, we're just grateful. Your heart is to connect with us, and you have created so many ways to do that. So many opportunities for us to explore you, place our trust in you, get to know with you, grow with you, follow you. And so God, I just ask that you'd make it clear to us, sitting right where we're at, watching wherever we're watching from, that you'd show us. You'd put that tug in our heart. What's the next step? The one brick to lay. Not over a lifetime, but today. What do you have for us? Would you give us that courage to take it? God, we love you. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Thank you guys for hanging with us. We'll see you next week for part 4.